Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brian Sukup, Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for the American Society of Interior Designers, and I'm joined by Emily Kelly and Abby Rathbun, IIDA's Government Affairs staff leaders. Welcome to the fourth of 6 installments in a series of jointly hosted ASID and IIDA advocacy trainings. ASID and IIDA believe that all members of the profession, ASID, IIDA, and unaffiliated, must work together to present a strong, unified front to advance and defend the profession in the legislative and regulatory arena. Today's webinar is led by Andrew Goldberg from Agora. Andrew is a seasoned government affairs professional with years of experience leading government affairs initiatives in the design and built environment industries. Finally, this is a important reminder that participants today will be eligible for continuing education credit from IDCEC. You should have input your IDCEC number when registering. If you haven't done so, you can reach out to Emily Kelly at IIDA and we can add that after the webinar. This course is not eligible for HSW credit. All lines are currently muted, but if you have any questions, please use the question box function, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the program. Without further delay, IIDA and ASID would like to welcome Andrew Goldberg. Andrew?
Great. Thank you so much, Brian and Emily and Abby and everybody, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar today. As Brian mentioned, this is a part of a series of webinars that ASID and IIDA are putting on to help members become better, stronger advocates for the profession. In our first webinar back in February, we talked about advocacy in a very basic way, what it is, why it's important to be an advocate for the interior design profession, and the different roles that lobbyists and advocates and grassroots advocates play. In our second webinar back in May, we got into a little more detail. We talked about how to build effective and lasting relationships with policymakers. And in our third webinar at the start of the summer, we discussed how you can become a really effective advocate for the profession, how to conduct a successful meeting with your legislators, and how to make sure that the message you convey is as effective as it can be. Now, in today's webinar, we're going to show how all of these pieces come together to create a successful advocacy campaign. Now, to begin with, what do I mean by an advocacy campaign? I'm not talking about a political campaign where somebody is running for office and running a campaign to win an election. What I'm talking about with an advocacy campaign is the effort to advance policy, specifically to get a legislative body to pass legislation that you support, or perhaps convincing a legislative body to block legislation that you don't support. It's about the effort to get to a point where your policy ideas can be successful and move forward in the legislature. Now, the first point I want to make, and this is really, really very important, and I can't stress it enough, is that the first step in developing any kind of campaign, whatever kind of campaign it is not about coming up with the tactics. The first step is coming up with an overarching strategy. A lot of folks fall into the trap of going right towards tactics when they have some challenge ahead of them. In the case of advocacy, it's not uncommon where if you hear a bill is coming up before a legislature that you want to work on, people immediately think, okay, well, there's a big bill coming up, so let's write an op-ed piece for the newspaper, or let's send out a press release, or let's just talk to the first legislator who we happen to run into. That really is not being strategic. A good strategy ensures that everything you do from the beginning of the process until the end actually helps you move towards the goal. And this is really important because resources are limited. You probably will have a limited time to make your case. You'll have limited money and limited volunteers or staff. And you'll have limited opportunities to make the best case to the right people who will be deciding your issue. If you rush into action without thinking first of which tactics make the most sense and make the best use of those limited resources, you are probably going to end up wasting time and money and goodwill, and you're going to be less successful. Without any kind of organization or strategy, you end up missing opportunities. To make your case effectively, you have to play catch up when threats arise, and you're really just not as prepared as you could be. So coming up with a strategy is very important. That's what we're going to talk about today. I would also add a very important part of an advocacy campaign is knowing who's in charge. The person who everybody reports to and whose job it is to coordinate the overall strategy and make sure that all the pieces are working in tandem. In the case of ASID and IIDA, it probably would be the person that the state chapter identifies. It could be a volunteer, a staff person, or an advocacy chair, or somebody. But it's very important to know who is in charge and make sure that person is identified and everybody knows they are overseeing the entire process. So what does that strategy look like to get a bill passed in the legislature or get your policy advanced? When I worked at the American Institute of Architects, we often thought that our advocacy efforts have really 5 key elements, all of which are essential and need to work together. You see them there: policy, legislative, grassroots, communications, and coalitions. And I'm going to go through and talk about each of them. The first 2, policy and legislative, really form the foundation of your strategy, and really say this is what the goal here is. And then the last 3 are some of the key tools you use to then make sure that strategy is successful. So like I said, the first one is the policy. And in short, when I say policy, it means what are you advocating for or against? Is there a bill before the state legislature involving title or practice act that you're trying to get passed? Is there an effort to, let's say, impose sales tax on professional services that you're trying to oppose? What is the actual policy effort that you are trying to work on? And the bulk of that effort has to happen really before the campaign starts. You kind of need to know beforehand, this is what we are advocating for or what we believe to be the good policy. This is especially true at the state level, where bills can come up and move fairly quickly. State legislative sessions tend to be, could be a little shorter. And so you really have to have a clear sense of what your goals are and from a policy standpoint early on. Now, when I talk about legislative vehicles, what we're talking about is essentially how a legislature actually does advance policy. It's very important to know where the opportunities are to actually move policy forward and how the legislature is going to do that. In general, there are 3 main legislative vehicles, tactics or processes that legislators use to advance policy. The first one on the left is a bill. A bill is basically, it's a proposal by a legislator or legislators to amend current law to advance a certain policy goal. Legislators introduce these bills to the legislative body, and if they have enough support, committees will debate them and advance them to the full chamber. And if a bill passes both chambers in the exact same form, it will go to the governor, who can then veto it or sign it into law. An amendment in the middle is how legislators try to change a section or part of a bill that's been introduced. So when a bill is before a committee, the committee holds what's known as a markup, which is a meeting where members can offer amendments to change the underlying bill. An amendment could change a single word, it could change a section, it could add a section, it could delete a section of a bill, it could even take out the entire contents of the bill and replace it with something very different. And members can also offer amendments before the full chamber. And there are times that there may be a bill you support, but somebody's going to offer an amendment that changes it in a way that you don't like. So you may support the bill but oppose the amendment, and vice versa. Third is report language. And reports are written by committees when they approve legislation. And they describe the intent of the bill. They provide some context, some history, why the committee is taking this action, and what the intent of the bill is. Reports don't have the force of law, but they can be used in judicial proceedings to help determine what the intent of the legislature was when they passed a bill. In advocacy, your job, your role in an advocacy campaign is almost always going to be to either get a bill passed or blocked, or to get an amendment passed or blocked. On occasion, it may be involving report language, but that's less likely. But understanding that is very important. Your goal in that campaign is to get this bill over the finish line, get a majority of the committee and the chamber to support it and keep it moving, or like I said, vice versa, if it's a bad bill, to block it or amend it to make it better. once you have a clear sense of what your goal is to get this bill passed or blocked, you also need to have a very clear sense of the argument you're going to make for why your position matters and why you believe the legislature should take the action you want them to take. In the last webinar back in June, we talked a bit about persuasion and about messaging. We talked about the 3 modes of persuasion: ethos, which is about showing your credibility; logos, using facts and figures and data to make your case; and pathos, making the emotional appeal. And it's very important when you embark on a legislative campaign, an advocacy campaign, to make sure you have your case, your argument in order. Make sure you have the data that you're going to use, the data points, the study that helps to reinforce your case. Make sure you have the more emotional argument, the stories that help make the argument, stories about people or incidents or things that happen that show why this legislation is needed. Also, it's very important to assess the opposition. Who is against you? What groups out there might oppose your position? And what are their arguments to oppose your position? What are the stats, the data, the stories that they may use? You want to think about that and have a good sense of that so that you can then rebut those positions. So the first part of the advocacy campaign is basically getting your ducks in a row, understanding what the legislature is going to do, what vehicle they are using to advance policy, and making sure you have your arguments in hand ready to go about why the legislature should take the actions that you want them to do. The second part of the process then is legislative. It's about making sure that the people who have the power to affect policy change are on your side. You need to know who has the power to make that happen. Now, there may be hundreds of members of the legislature, of the state house or state senate or assembly or whatever. And ultimately, every member of that body will be voting on legislation. But they're not all equally important. The people you really have to focus on are 2 groups: members of a committee and the leadership. Now, state legislatures as well as Congress and others are organized into committees where much of the heavy lifting of legislation takes place. Committees are centered around certain policy issues, so there could be an agriculture committee, an education committee, and so on and so forth. And typically, the representatives who sit on a particular committee are going to have the most influence over legislation before that committee because they are on it. They are part of that committee. And so they are the folks you really want to target to make your case. If you can get a good outcome in committee, that makes your job so much easier when a bill goes on to the floor and to the next chamber and so on. And even on committees, not all members are equal. A more senior member may carry more influence over their colleagues than a junior member. And members of the majority party may be more valuable targets than those in the minority, especially if the committee is partisan. So in general, committees have the same partisan makeup as the entire body. So if the Republicans control the state house, then on the committees, there will be more Republicans on the committee than Democrats, and they will call the shots. And so working with the majority party often may have more value than the minority party. In some cases, committees have subcommittees, and these take on slightly more granular look at various issues before the committee, and they may take up a bill before it goes to the full committee. And so members of the full committee who sit on the subcommittee carry even more weight than members of the full committee. So talking and making sure the committee is on board is very important. In the same way, leadership is very important. And by leadership, I mean the leadership of the body, the Speaker of the House, the majority leader, the minority leader, the whips, the folks who really are controlling the agenda of the legislative body. Because they are the ones, especially the majority side, who will decide what ultimately comes to the floor for a vote. And they'll be the ones who are most likely going to be in the room when the bill is negotiated between the various chambers and with the governor or with the White House. Now, typically, leadership members don't get involved in all the details of bills. That's why you have committees to get involved in the details. But you want them to know about your position and your issues and why they care, because they, again, carry a lot of weight over all the members of their party. Now, this doesn't mean that you ignore all the other members of the legislature, folks who are not in leadership or not on the committee, because again, they will have a vote in the full House. But you need to focus your efforts on those who carry the most weight on a bill. And by the way, I'll also add, this is why it's really important to know which committee handles which bills. If a certain bill comes up that you want to advocate on, knowing where it's going to go, what committee will deal with it, is very important, because if you start talking to members who are not on that committee, you might not be as effective as you could be, and you should be targeting those who are on the committee. Now, once you know which the relevant committee is, your job as part of an advocacy campaign is to get a majority of that committee to agree with you. It's pretty straightforward. And remember, you don't need to have every member of the committee to support you. You really need 50% plus one. You need a majority. So for example, if there's a committee, let's say there's a bill that you're trying to get passed, and it goes before a committee that has, say, 21 members on it, that means that you need to get at least 11 members, a majority, to be on your side and to vote with you. Now, getting more support than just the bare minimum is ideal, of course. You want to get as much support as you can. That's great. Sometimes legislators can change their minds at the last minute, and so having a little cushion is always helpful. In addition, if a bill passed a committee with a very strong vote with 2/3 or 3/4 or unanimous support, that may help give it some momentum when it goes to the full chamber. But again, the base job, the minimum is to make sure you get a majority of folks to support your position so that it can move forward. So the first step, of course, when dealing with a committee in an advocacy campaign is to figure out, well, where are the members of the committee on this issue? And the easiest way, of course, is to ask them. Find out, call their offices and find out where they stand on the issue. Once you do that, you can start to develop a chart and start to prioritize. As I said, committees have a lot of members. They may have anywhere from 10 members to 30 or so. That's a lot of folks you want to reach out to and engage with. How do you prioritize who you talk to on the committee? How do you make sure that you get to that majority of members on the committee using being as efficient and effective and with your resources as possible? In general, of course, if there's a committee that deals with your issues, you want to engage with all of them. This is why laying the groundwork by building a relationship with legislators throughout the year all the time is so important, because it's a lot harder to persuade a legislator to take your position if they don't know you and they don't know who you are. And that's why we talked in the second webinar about building those relationships year round so that they know you when a bill is coming up. But again, you have limited resources. So how do you prioritize? How do you decide where you're going to put your efforts to get to that majority? One of the simple ways that a lot of advocates use is to make a chart, like the one that you see on the screen on a piece of paper. You have 5 columns, and you put 2 plus signs, a plus, 0, then 1 negative, and 2 negatives. And then what you do is when you figure out how many members of the committee there are. So in this case, there are 21 members of this committee. Again, that means you need to get at least 11 on your side. And as you find out where members stand on your issue, you start to fill in the boxes. So the 2 plus column, those are members who are your champions, the members who really support you. They will vote with you no matter what. They totally are with you 100%. The next column, the 1 plus, are members who are leaning in favor, are sympathetic. You think they'll vote with you, but they're not entirely sure. Maybe they're leaning yes, or they're not sure. On the other side, the double minus are members who are dead set against you. They are opposed to you 100% on this issue. They always have been. They are not going to support you no matter what. The 1 minus are members then who are leaning against you. Maybe persuadable. Right now, they're kind of against you, but not firmly. And then in the middle column, the 0, are the members where they don't have a position yet. They're undecided, or perhaps you don't know what their position is. So now looking at this chart, you could already see something. You have already guaranteed 3 yes votes, the 3 members in the double plus. You have 4 members who are leaning yes, so hopefully you can count on them, not guaranteed. But that gives you 7 votes. So you need at least 11 votes. You need at least 4 more votes from those other folks. So how do you decide who to talk to on this committee when you have limited time and limited resources? Well, what most people do is this. Take the folks who are on the double negative column and just put them aside. If you have limited time, there really is no reason to talk to legislators that you know are dead set against you, that you know you're not going to convince to vote with you. Now, let me be clear, that doesn't mean that you stop trying to build a long-term relationship with them. You still should. They may support you on other issues. And over time, you might be able to even win them over on this particular issue. But in a very time-sensitive environment, when you have a vote coming up very fairly soon, there's really no benefit to talk to them, so put them aside. On the other side of the chart, the 2+ column, do you talk to them? They're strongly in favor of your position. Do you ignore them completely? Do you say, oh, they're good, we don't need to talk to them? Not necessarily. They are a lower priority, but it's never a bad idea if you have the ability to touch base with them and thank them for their support. Maybe if they're champions, you could impress upon them, convince them to try to help and persuade some of their colleagues who are undecided. But again, it's a lower priority. What you're left with are the folks in the middle, the 3 columns there, the leaning yes, undecided, and leaning no. Those are the people who are the priority, to make sure you can get them to vote with you. And that's where you want to spend most of your time. That is the beginning of the prioritization process of deciding who you're going to reach out to and who you're going to engage with to get you to vote. Remember, the purpose of the entire campaign, the goal of this entire campaign is to get a majority, get to 11 votes on this committee. So you're trying to get 11 votes, or really, I guess, really 8 more votes to go along with the 3 you already have to support you. Now, even within this list of priorities, there are bigger priorities on this list. For example, there are some of those members may be in the majority party. And while ASID and IIDA are bipartisan organizations working with people on both sides, the reality is that members who are in the majority party carry a little more weight, because if you get more members of the majority party to support you in committee, you're also going to get a majority of the majority, hopefully, on the floor. So identifying which members are part of the majority party in the chamber is useful as a priority. Second, who are the senior members? Who are the chairs or ranking minority members of the committee, or members who've been on the committee a long time, who you know carry a lot of influence with other members? Their priorities as well. You want to make sure you reach them, because if they come out and say, yes, I will support you, they may bring more members along with you. So that's the second level of prioritization. And then the third is looking at who you know, who your organization knows. Are there members in those columns with whom you have a good relationship with, who have met with interior designers before or have some other connection to you? Since building that new relationship on the eve of a vote is very tricky, finding members who you already have that relationship with, who you can reach out to and touch base quickly, and you know they'll get back to you, they'll listen to you, that's another way that you prioritize. And so even within the prioritization of the undecideds and leaning yes, leaning no, there are people you want to look at to say, these are the first people we want to reach out to get them on our side. Once you've done that, once you've built that priority list, you've completed a very important part, because you've really developed the overarching strategy. You know what your issue is. You know what your goal is, to get a bill passed or an amendment approved or blocked. You know how many votes you need, and you know where your priority is in terms of getting more members to be on your side. So then what do you do? How do you actually do that? How do you actually then engage with these members? That's where the next parts of the advocacy strategy, the advocacy campaign strategy, come into play, and how you actually then work to persuade these members to take your side, to agree with your position. And as I said, there are 3 parts. The first is grassroots and grass tops. To begin with, what do we mean by grassroots and grass tops? So grassroots refers to the engagement by everyday citizens in making positive change for their community or for their state or for their country. It's efforts of people who are not professional lobbyists, who are everyday people who volunteer some of their time and their energy to be involved on issues they care about. It's the people, most simply. Grass tops is similar, but it refers to people who have developed a closer relationship with policymakers, who are able to impact them in a more direct way. So somebody who actually knows socially a particular legislator, or has worked closely with the legislator, who can call that person up or text them and you know, make their case. And both of those are very important parts of the grassroots effort. because grassroots and grass tops matter because, and we've said this a lot during this webinar, the most effective advocates for any position are the constituents of the legislators who are voting on it. Legislators listen to the people from back home, their constituents, they're the voters essentially in their districts or in their states. You understand the issues, you know the community, the culture of where you come from. And so having interior designers from a state legislator's district reach out and say, hey, I'm an interior designer, I'm from your district, I'm from this town or that city, and I want you to support this. That is very valuable and very effective. Now, how do you do that? How do you actually make the connection between the grass tops and the legislators? There are a number of ways to do this. So I'll mention three of the big ways. First and foremost are action alerts. Like many organizations, ASID and IIDA use software that enables them to email their members, interior designers, in a particular state or even in a particular legislative district, and ask their members to contact their elected representatives. And many of you may have gotten a message saying, hey, there's a bill coming up before the state legislature or even Congress that does X, Y, or Z. We want you to contact your representative and tell them to vote this way on that issue. These systems make it very easy for interior designers to send a message to the representatives at the click of a button, and they get an email. Now, email is not necessarily the most personalized way or most intense way of contacting representatives, but it does work, especially at the state level when state representatives often don't get as much mail. When I was at AIA, we had something happened about 5-6 years ago where there was a big issue coming up in a Midwest state. The AIA chapter sent out an action alert to architects in the state. They started sending up messages to their representatives in the state capitol. And finally, the office of the Speaker of the State House called the AIA chapter and said, please stop it, we get it, call off the dogs. They got so many messages from architects that they broke through. People heard that, and eventually AIA won on that issue. So it does make a difference. The second way, which is a little more involved but also has an even bigger impact, are phone calls. Having interior designers call up their representative's office on the phone in advance of a vote is a very powerful tool. Now, it's especially effective if you have grass tops advocates who actually know the representative or his or her staff, who can text or send a message right away. But calling into a representative's office to say, please vote yes on this bill or no on this amendment or whatever, that does carry a lot of weight. The third thing that you can do, and it's a little more involved, but is actually organize meetings. Have interior designers come to the state capitol and meet with their representatives. That is a very powerful tool if you have a bunch of interior designers coming to the capitol and say, this is so important that we're coming up here to actually make the case. Now, that is more involved. There's a higher cost to it in terms of the amount of work you have to do to get people up to the hill and things like that. So you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of that. But it is certainly something that if it's a very important issue, and especially if you have a good number of interior designers who live near the Capitol who can get there fairly easily, that's a very effective way to do it. There are a number of other ways to get the grassroots to engage with their elected officials. I will mention as an aside, one that I've heard a lot in recent years that I don't feel is that effective, and I'll just put that out there, which is petition drives. Sites like change.org and others make it very easy to start an online petition in support of a certain issue. But because it is so easy to do that and get people to just click and sign on to it, petitions often don't carry the same amount of weight or effectiveness as sending the email, making the phone call, the in-person meeting. So something to think about is, the more effort you put in, certainly the bigger the impact it's going to be. And so making sure that you are able to reach out and engage with every targeted member on that committee with the grassroots or grass tops is a very important strategy. That's the first piece. The second piece then is about communications. And in this case, I'm talking about communicating through various communications channels that help to create more awareness about your issue. Now, to begin with, I'll say that when we're talking about communicating on an issue, it's very important to have a clear message about what it is you're looking for. In an advocacy campaign, that can be somewhat easy, because if your message is vote yes on this bill or vote no on this amendment, that's a pretty straightforward message. But it is very important to make sure that everybody in your campaign, in your effort, is saying the same thing. So what are some of the ways in which you can use communications out there to amplify your message? There are three primary ones, the traditional media, reporters, social media, and then doing op-eds. In terms of reporters, it can be very helpful if there are reporters, especially those in the state capitol who cover the legislature, especially those if they cover whatever committee or whatever issue is that they're talking about that impacts you, to reach out to reporters, send them a message and say, hey, we know that the committee is going to be voting soon on this issue. Here's our position. Some cases, reporters may write about that, which helps to create some more public pressure and support for your position. They may not write about it, but they may then contact offices in the state capitol, some of the legislators, the committee, and find out where they are, which is another way of letting the committee and the key members on that committee know what you are working, know that there are people out there who care about what they're working on. It's another way of getting that message out there in a broader way, particularly if there are reporters who everybody in the Capitol reads, or publications that everybody looks at, to get that message out there. Second is social media. Social media is increasingly becoming part of the advocacy landscape, just as it's taking over every other aspect of our lives. It's a great tool to be able to communicate with both the general public and also with legislators on your issue. Sending out messages where you tag a particular legislator on the key committee and say, hey, delegate so-and-so, please support this issue. It helps to build more awareness. It's something then that other interior designers and other supporters can also retweet or share on their social media pages. If there is a legislator who agrees with you, putting something out on social media, thanking them and celebrating that is a very great way to build goodwill and also build some more pressure. If there are hashtags out there that tie into whatever the issue is that's before the legislature that's related to you, making sure you use those hashtags so that you can build more awareness is another very good way of adding to that overall strategy of making sure that people on the committee are aware that you're out there and that you care about the issue. One thing I would say about social media, just as a practical matter and as advice, of course, is make sure that anything you put out there you're being polite, you're being respectful. Remember that nothing is ever deleted from the internet. So even if there are members of the legislature who oppose your position or others, remember that to offer your views, your position in a positive way, but make sure that you're not being impolite or saying bad things. Third, then there are op-eds and letters to the editor. Many newspapers, especially local and regional ones, are always hungry for new content. And getting an op-ed or a letter to the editor placed really isn't that hard. Essentially, and since really all newspapers now have online versions as well, you can leverage getting an op-ed or a letter to the editor placed by then sharing it in social media or sharing it with reporters and so on. A number of IIDA and ASID chapters have used this very well in the past, getting letters to the editor printed. And the staff at ASID and IIDA can also help with some of the ideas. It's also very useful if there are certain newspapers or publications that are read by everybody in the Capitol, that are well known in the Capitol, to try to get op-eds placed there, because then the audience of policymakers or legislators will read that. A communication strategy by itself is not going to help necessarily get you to win on an issue, but it's another tool that you can use that reinforces the messages that your grassroots are sending and make sure that that message you're getting to the legislature of what you want them to do is getting out there. The third part of that, and really the fifth element, so to speak, of the advocacy campaign is working in coalitions. There's a saying that there's strength in numbers, and that is definitely true in advocacy as well. Being able to identify other organizations, other groups, other companies that support your cause and are willing to sign on and are working for similar outcomes can be very effective. Having a coalition in support of a certain legislative outcome, it increases your overall power, the number of people who are working to get something done. It helps to demonstrate your issue's broad-based appeal, and also provides some third-party validation that it's not just one group of people looking for a certain policy outcome, but a broader group who have come from different walks of life. One important point I want to make in this context here, when I talk about coalitions, I'm not referring to the traditional interior design coalitions that some of you may be familiar with. In this context here, coalitions are with outside organizations that are beyond interior design, but who have a similar position on a specific issue. And the great thing about coalitions is you don't have to agree with another organization or a profession on every single issue out there to join a coalition on one issue. If you agree on that one issue, then you can join that coalition. It doesn't obligate you to then say you agree with them on everything. You could oppose a certain group on one set of issues and work with them on another. That is allowed. You can do that. And that happens a lot where interior designers can join with groups or other professions who have similar goals. So for example, if there's a bill coming up in your state that proposes to impose sales tax on professional services, developing a coalition that involves not just interior designers, but folks from the accounting profession, from medical groups, the AIA, landscape architects, engineers, all of whom have probably a similar position on the issue, can be a very effective way of building your power. The other benefit of a coalition is that it can help to fill some gaps. Let's say there's a certain member of a committee who's very influential, who is undecided or leaning against you, and you don't have a good relationship with them. You just don't really have an in with them. If you have a coalition and another member of that coalition has a good relationship with them, well, then that problem is solved. They can then take the lead on reaching out and engaging with that legislator. If a certain coalition has a really good relationship with an important reporter, then again, you can leverage that to then again expand your power and make sure you are hitting as many different opportunities to get your point across as possible. Now, sometimes coalitions can be formed into permanent coalitions, especially if there is a certain issue that comes up all the time. If sales tax on services comes up every year, for example, you could create a permanent coalition on that and give it a name and a logo and everything, but you don't have to. The thing about a coalition in an advocacy campaign is you can come together in one instance on a certain issue to work together, and you're not obligated to go beyond that. Now, sometimes you do, and I think it's very important when you do develop a coalition, whether it's temporary or longer term, to be very clear with your partners on certain things. What are the goals? To be very clear, our goal of this coalition is to get this bill passed and signed into law. Nothing more, nothing less. Knowing who is in charge or who makes decisions for that coalition is very important. It could be a team of people from different groups, which you have to navigate, but making sure that everybody knows who is making decisions, making sure you're communicating. When a bill is coming up before a legislature, things can move pretty quickly and happen pretty fast. So making sure that everybody is on the same page and knows what's happening is important. How do you make decisions? Let's say you have a coalition that is opposing a certain bill, and then the sponsor of that bill calls you up and says, well, tell you what, if we make these changes to the bill, would you be able to support it then? The coalition has to be able to decide. How do you decide? Okay, can we support it now or do we still oppose it? And how do you keep people accountable? If this member of the coalition says they will reach out to these legislators to talk to them, making sure they actually do that is very important, to make sure that everybody is working together in a trustful way, in a sincere way towards getting that goal. But like I said, getting a bunch of groups together, a bunch of associations, different perspectives, different professions, different groups together can build your, build your power. And like I said at the beginning, the goal of this entire process is getting to a majority, is getting to enough members of that committee and then the chamber to support your position. And so if a coalition can help you get that majority of members to support your goal of getting that bill passed, then it's worth doing. So using all of these tools together, you can begin to develop a campaign. You have the policy idea, you know what it is you are what the policy vehicle you're trying to influence, get this bill passed, oppose this amendment. You have your arguments, your case about why you should do it using good data, using good stories. You know where the opposition is. You then know who's going to make the decision, which committee in the legislature is going to be voting on this. You know who your top targets are on that committee. You know you have 3 or 4 definite yes votes. You need 5 or 6 more to get a majority, so you know who you're going to reach out to first. And then you're using your grassroots and your grass tops to actually get the constituents, the voters, the citizens to engage with those members. You're using your communications tools to continue to build awareness and also engage even more with these policymakers and put some little pressure on them to say this is the right position. And you're employing your coalition. You're using other partners to help fill in some of the gaps and make sure that you're reaching it together. Putting that all together, looking at it holistically, is very important, because then you have to identify certain gaps you may have. Maybe there's a certain member of the committee you're not reaching out to because you don't have a relationship with them. It helps you understand, are you spreading out the work evenly? This happens a lot, and sometimes, especially in volunteer efforts, when they use a lot of volunteers. You may ask one particular person to contact a bunch of state representatives to persuade them to support your position, but you've also asked that same person to manage a coalition and also be in charge of social media. That's a lot to do, and so looking at all the pieces and making sure you're spreading out the work is very important. And being very clear, again, who is in charge of the overall strategy, who is the general, who is going to be organizing all this, is very important. And so what you can do is then, taking all that information, is you can create a kind of a matrix. And this is an example up on the screen right now, where I took all those members who were in those 3 columns. Remember, lean yes, undecided, lean no. I put down which party they're in, whether they're part of seniority, and then after that, go through, here are all the different ways we're going to reach them. We're going to send out an action alert to a bunch of them, although there are a couple who maybe there aren't members, ASID or IID members in that district, so that's something to keep in mind. You have the grass tops. There are certain members or people involved with the association who are going to reach out to them. Communications, how are you going to target certain ones using your communications? How coalitions are going to help them. And you begin to develop a work plan for how you're going to make sure that you engage with all of these members, these key members, targeted members of that committee. And from that, you can also see if there are gaps. For example, this one member here, where you don't have any grass tops going on, any communications, any other coalitions are going to reach out. It helps you identify, okay, here's a place where we need some extra thinking about how we can reach this particular member of the committee to convince them to vote yes. That is what a strategy really looks like, in a very admittedly simple way. It's about making sure that you can get to a majority of that committee to vote in favor of your position, and using all the tools at your disposal in as effective a way as possible. Now, I will say this, no matter how good a plan you make, there's always going to be something that comes up that's unexpected at the last minute. Perhaps one of the members of the committee who is your champion announces they suddenly are resigning from the legislature, or maybe your opponent suddenly, blanket every bus shelter in the capital city with ads opposing your position and raising awareness. Things do happen in a campaign that are unexpected, and pretty much by definition, you can't expect the unexpected. You can't plan for it. But by having a clear strategy and clear roles, and understanding that your goal here, your primary goal, is to get a majority of support, that's going to help you weather some of these last-minute unexpected developments and road bumps along the way. Having a good strategy helps you become more effective as you move on. Now, this has been admittedly a fairly brief and kind of high-level overview of what a strategy looks like, but my goal here really was to talk about how important it is to have that strategy at the very beginning, because when a bill comes up and you want to get that bill passed, or you want to block that bill, there's not a lot of time, there's not a lot of resources, things are moving very quickly, and so keeping in mind how you use all the tools at your disposal in the most effective way possible makes all the difference. And so really, to sum it up, and then I want to throw it back to Brian and Emily and see if there are questions, just to sum up what we talked about is, first and foremost, as I said, strategy always comes before tactics. Figure out what is your end goal, and then think about what are the things you can do to get you to that goal. An advocacy campaign has 5 broad elements: knowing what the policy goal is, who is in power in the legislature to make that policy goal happen, how you use the constituents, the grassroots and grass tops to help you, how you utilize communications tools, and how you engage with others in a coalition to help make that happen. It's important to know who the key policymakers are. Yes, you want every member of the state legislature or Congress to support your position, ideally, but understanding that these are the key members who you really have to reach in order to be successful is very important. Prioritizing, reaching out to those lawmakers whose positions are undecided or are less solid to move them into the definite yes category is where you have to prioritize your efforts. Using the grassroots and the grass tops is very effective. It is the most effective way to get a lawmaker to take your side. Making sure that your communications efforts across all different channels, the message is clear and consistent so everybody understands it. Using coalitions is great when everybody is clear on the goal and the expectations that they have, or their accountability, what they are expected to do, and what the overall goal is. And putting everything together in a plan, having a clear strategy before you go out the door and start advocating, having that holistic plan helps you identify where there are gaps or redundancies or problems that you need to address, and that helps you then weather any storms that come up. I will say this, in any kind of advocacy campaign, which you're trying to get any kind of policy passed, there's no guarantee that you will succeed, especially if it is controversial. There are people on the other side who are working hard to take a different position. But I will say this, that having a strategy, using all these tools in an effective way, it works. It's something that I did with my colleagues at the AIA. We did this to get legislation passed at the state level, at the federal level, the local level, and it makes sure that you can use all the tools at your disposal as effectively as possible. And if you do that, and if you really focus on the end goal and use all the tools that you have in an effective way, then more often than not, yeah, you are going to succeed. With that, I want to thank you for being on the call today. I'm going to throw it back now to Brian and Emily, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that folks have, and just say thank you again for being on the call today.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. We'll now take questions until the top of the hour. The question and answer period will not be recorded. Please use your question box to ask questions, and due to time constraints, we will not be able to answer all questions, but Andrew, Abby, Emily, and I are always available by email to answer any questions that might not get asked today. So Andrew, our first question for you is, what if I'm the constituent of someone not in the committee, not on the committee, or in leadership? How do I build relationships with the important legislators if I'm not their constituent?
I think that's a very good question. So a couple of points. First of all, I would say is that no matter what issue is hot right now or what's coming up in the next session, building a relationship with all legislators is important. And as we talked about in one of the earlier sessions, the ideal time to build a relationship is not right before a big vote's coming up or you need something from them, but early on in the process, when you can kind of build that trust and that rapport. So I think it's always important to do that. As I said, of course, even though you want to prioritize on leadership and committees, every member of the legislature will vote on a certain issue. So certainly you want to stay in touch with them. Now, if they are on another committee that may deal with other issues you care about, then that's fine. Then you don't need to really engage with them in a very intense way on this particular issue, but you kind of hold that in reserve for those other issues. But I think there are other things you can do also. I mean, doing some of the communications, writing op-eds or letters to the editor is a way that you can help. If you do social media, you can do that. If you have connections and contacts with other associations or other groups that they have a similar interest who could be part of a coalition, you can help that way. I think like I said, there are a number of different ways that any one person can kind of help the overall effort, because it does take a lot of people. All the work I talked about, these are things that could be happening in a matter of a week or maybe even less sometimes. And so being available to do all those, some of those other tasks can be very helpful. But again, as I said, at the end of the day, no matter who your legislator is, no matter what committees they are on or positions, building that relationship in a consistent throughout the year kind of basis is vitally important. Because you know what, next year they may be on a committee where this other hot issue is coming up, or they may run for the state senate or the U.S. Congress or be in another position. So even if they are not, like I said, right in the line of fire, or right a big target on that particular issue, that particular week or that particular session, there's still so much benefit in terms of building that relationship and those connections. Other thing I would say is then if there's somebody who's not on the committee, but they're become a real champion, they agree with you. I mean, they know members on that committee. They're, you know, the person who has the office next to them could be on that committee, or another member of the legislature they work with a lot could be. So you could also recruit them to kind of help make the case to other members in the legislative body to support your position.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next question is about coalitions. How do we convince outside organizations to support interior design practice rights in a coalition if practice rights only benefit interior designers?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I'll offer a thought. I know Brian and Emily may have some thoughts also, because you probably deal with this. What I would say, the way I would approach it is this. You know, I think it's thinking about it in a larger way. The reason that interior designers are advocating for title or practice, obviously there is a benefit to interior designers, but there's also a benefit to the public in terms of having, you know, better qualified design professionals out there. And so perhaps it's thinking about, are there business groups out there who are always looking out for ways to help small businesses get ahead, like interior designers? Are there groups that are involved with, you know, building safety or something, who see a benefit to this? I think thinking outside a little bit, perhaps just kind of the profession world, but thinking about what the impact is on the broader community, broader society of the policy can help sometimes identify coalition partners you might not have thought of. And the benefit there also is, you know, most legislators recognize that when people come in and advocate for something, particularly if it's business related, yeah, they have some self-interest, understood. People are looking for a better business environment for what they do. But if you bring in some of those kind of third-party validators, folks who are not benefiting, who are not perceived as benefiting directly financially, but saying, no, this is good for the overall economy, good for the community, that adds credibility, and that really adds that kind of support.
Great, thank you. What if the coalition needs to split in the middle of an advocacy effort because something happens like an amendment and the coalition members can't agree on whether to support or oppose the amendment or the bill?
Well, it happens sometimes, and in fact, you know, if I was a legislator and it was kind of smart, I might actually do that, right? I might try to find a way to sort of, you know, drive a wedge between parts of the coalition. Look, I think as long as you start out with a very clear sense of this is what we want and a very clear decision-making process, then that could happen. That may very well happen, and it's something you have to really consider. If it does happen, it happens. One thing you have to recognize in a coalition is that every group is still going to be looking out for their primary interest, you know, what their perspective is. And so there may be cases where a group might say, you know, we can't support this anymore, and they might go off. I think talking about it beforehand, having a good sense of scenarios. Okay, are we all going to agree that we will all oppose this, you know, no matter what, or here's beyond this point is where our support lies, or understanding from potential coalition partners who say, look, you know, if this is part of the bill or this becomes part of it, we may be in a different position. I think that helps. But the reality is that these ad hoc coalitions, sometimes that does happen. And like I said, a smart, crafty legislator may think of a way to try to peel off one group or another. But I also say, you know, part of the benefit of coalitions is, even though it is a short-term effort, it's thinking long-term. And there may be times when the coalition partners can agree, like that, okay, right now there's a new provision that some of us kind of like, some of us don't. We're going to agree to stay united because we feel that it's more important for us to show that we are working together, even though I might not get everything out of the bill that I want. If the changes are fairly small and if groups can support that, you may be able to keep folks together. But at the end of the day, every member of the coalition is there voluntarily. They choose to be there. And I think that's why it's very important to have a very clear sense of this is what our goal is, what our expectations are, and if some groups do leave, well, they leave. And I think you just have to sort of double down with the folks you have and talk about how it still is a very broad coalition that's going to move forward.
Thanks, Andrew. We've got another one. How do you approach a legislator after he or she flips on you?
That's a tricky one. That's an awkward conversation, I suppose. Let's assume for a second somebody you know reasonably well and stuff. I mean, I think it's really fine to ask. I think. I mean, my view is, if as a lobbyist, if there was a legislator who said they would vote with us and they voted against us, yeah, I would ask. I would, of course, do it politely. Of course, I would not do that, but try to understand what caused them to change their vote. Was there something that the opposition said, that or point they made that changed it? Was it some sort of political pressure? And the reality is that I think in many cases you probably can kind of figure out why they did. It may take some digging, but you can kind of understand why. There usually is some hard reason about somebody they know back in the district who is very influential, who changed their kind of changed their mind or pressed upon them. There's no kind of easy way to do that. My advice would be that perhaps the next time maybe not be as perhaps you don't want to necessarily rely on that person as much on issues. Don't think of them as much as a champion if there's somebody who is going to change. And look, sometimes legitimately policymakers have reasons for flipping. They do get more information. They do find something out that a position they had would be harmful in some way to their constituents. Hopefully there's they give you an opportunity to sort of, they may say to you, hey, I'm having second thoughts, and have that discussion with you. But if they don't, and at the last minute they change their vote, ultimately they are accountable to you. You are the constituents. They work for you. They work for us. And I think, ask them and trying to find out why is very useful.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. We're almost at the top of the hour, so that will conclude today's session. We look forward to hosting Andrew and all of you on our next Joint Profession-Wide Advocacy Training webinar in late October. Additionally, next month, ASID will host another organization to be determined for the next installment in its public policy webinar series. All are welcome, so stay tuned for details. We hope you enjoyed today's session, and we hope that you'll tell your colleagues and chapter members about these webinars. And always remember that for up-to-the-minute advocacy updates, join our phone-to-action alert system by texting the term interior design to the number 52886. Again, that's texting the term interior design to the number 52886. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.